8 months completely alone at sea. It is 1969 and communication with home is limited. It is just you and your mind, thinking about all the mistakes you've made in your life that have led you to this point. This is where 36-year-old Donald Crowhurst found himself. He now had to make a critical decision. In May 1967, Francis Chichester became the first person to sail around the world solo. He made one stop in Sydney and after 9 months alone on the open seas, returned home to England and was greeted by 250,000 well-wishers. He was a national hero and was knighted soon after. The following year, the British Sunday Times newspaper decided to sponsor the first non-stop solo round-the-world yacht race. It was an open race with no qualifying requirements, as long as competitors started between June 1st and October 31st to ensure they passed through the Southern Ocean during summer. The first person to complete the feat would be awarded with the Golden Globe Trophy, and whoever recorded the fastest time would win £5,000, equivalent to roughly £70,000 today. 9 men entered the race. All were highly experienced and esteemed yachtsmen and sailors, except for one man, Donald Crowhurst. Donald Crowhurst was a business owner and amateur sailor from Bridgewater in Somerset, England. Growing up, his family was very poor, and Donald had to leave school early when his father died. Donald worked in the Air Force in the 1950s as a pilot and as an engineer. He married his wife Claire in 1957, and together they had 4 children. In Bridgewater, Donald started his own electronics company, Electron Utilization, and manufactured navigational equipment. Business was slow. Donald made just enough money to feed his family and keep a roof over their heads. He always had a yearning for adventure and begun to feel like he hadn't used his skills and abilities to achieve his full potential. When Donald heard about the Golden Globe race around the world, he felt compelled to enter. If he could build a boat using his own electronics and inventions, then complete the race or even win, it would generate a huge amount of publicity. He would become a national hero like Francis Chichester. He believed this was his chance to completely turn his life around. While other competitors already had boats that just needed some modifications, Donald needed to build one from scratch. He came up with a modified trimaran design that would be equipped with advanced electronics that would make it faster and safer. The only thing missing was money. Donald mortgaged his house, then secured 2 sponsors, the town of Teignmouth in Devon, and local businessman Stanley Best, an investor of Donald's company, Electron Utilization. The vessel was named Teignmouth Electron after its 2 sponsors. Donald could finally get to work on his boat and was optimistic about his adventure. However, his money issues were just the first of many, many problems that would arise. Donald was convinced that the trimaran model with the hulls on either side of the main hull would be ideal for speed as well as safety. He believed it was the best option to get him across the choppy waters of the Southern Ocean. He planned to install additional safety measures he designed himself, as well as a revolutionary computer that would sense when the boat was tipping and trigger a flotation device. The Teignmouth Electron was designed with very few non-essentials, so it would be lightweight and therefore travel faster. The living quarters were considerably smaller than those of Donald's fellow competitors. He also only brought 5 books for what could be up to 8 or 9 months at sea. With the October 31st deadline looming closer and budget running out, Donald had to rush to complete the boat. He was forced to cut corners. He had to forego his computer and made some less than ideal substitutions on various parts of the boat. On top of everything, Stanley Best, one of the sponsors, made Donald sign an agreement. If Donald dropped out of the race before it began, or if he dropped out early on, he would have to pay back the cost of the Teignmouth Electron, which would completely bankrupt him. Everything was on the line. He had no choice but to successfully complete the round-the-world race. On September 23rd, Donald sailed the Teignmouth Electron on its maiden voyage to its namesake and sponsor town. Donald's publicity officer believed officially starting the race from Teignmouth would attract visitors and press and boost the image and economy of the town. The voyage to Teignmouth was supposed to take 3 days, but ended up taking 2 weeks. Donald's wife Claire was tasked with christening the boat by releasing a champagne bottle tied to a ribbon, but the bottle didn't smash and instead bounced off the hull, which is considered bad luck. One of the boat's builders quickly grabbed the bottle and smashed it by hand. The boat was damaged on its maiden voyage, and it was also discovered that it could not perform windward. In other words, it could not travel against the wind, but there was no time for repairs. The other competitors had already begun their journeys. In fact, 2 men had already dropped out of the race when they reached the Southern Ocean. There was no chance Donald could win the Golden Globe trophy for first man home, but there was still the £5,000 cash prize for the fastest time. In the days leading up to the deadline, it was total chaos. Donald and the boat builders were scrambling to get everything done, but they were dangerously behind schedule. Donald was also proving to be a clumsy sailor and was imprecise with navigation. He simply wasn't ready. It was a terrible predicament. Either he drops out of the race, goes bankrupt, and plunges his family into poverty, or he takes the unfinished boat out to sea to face near certain death. The night before the deadline, Donald confessed to his sponsor, Stanley Best, about the issues, but Stanley reminded him of the agreement, and the next day, Donald got ready to start the race. On the 31st of October 1968, crowds gathered in Teignmouth to watch 36-year-old Donald Crowhurst begin his solo voyage around the world. Donald farewelled his wife Claire and his 4 children and took off. However, immediately there was an issue with the sails and the boat had to be towed back for repairs. Finally, at the very last moment before the race deadline, Donald departed on the Teignmouth Electron, and before long, he was just a tiny speck on the horizon. Modern sea vessels have GPS and internet access and are able to maintain communication lines at all times. In the 1960s, the only way for boats out at sea to communicate with land was via radio calls and telegrams. There were no satellites that could pinpoint your exact location. You couldn't text or FaceTime anyone. You were truly and utterly alone in the vast and unforgiving expanse of the ocean. Donald had a long journey ahead of him. First down to the South Atlantic, past the Cape of Good Hope, where he would then hit the Roaring Forties. The lack of large land masses in the Southern Ocean causes extremely strong westerly winds, creating endless storms that circle the planet, producing waves of up to 10 meters or 33 feet high. Thousands and thousands of miles later, he would pass the south of Australia and New Zealand, and sail across the Pacific to Cape Horn, where the seas are very violent. Finally, he would sail north past the equator, back into the Atlantic and home to Britain. That was the plan anyway. Donald struggled with his boat for the first few weeks of his voyage. It was unfinished, damaged and leaking, and any fixes he could make would certainly not survive the turbulent southern seas. The BBC provided him with a camera and tape recorder, and Donald did a good job of appearing like everything was going well, but his logbook told a different story. He wrote about how he believed his chances of survival were, quote, 50-50, and that soon he would have to make, quote, a bloody awful decision. Meanwhile, 3 more men had dropped out of the race due to illness and dangerous conditions. Robin Knox-Johnston was in the lead. For over a month, Donald made slow progress in the race while he agonized over what to do. Continue the race in a boat that was falling apart and drown? Give up, drop out of the race and face financial ruin? Or he could lie about his positions, hang tight in the South Atlantic for a few months, and then sail home to Britain. The competitors were required to report their positions regularly via radio or telegram. From December 6th, Donald began reporting vague and sometimes cryptic, false positions and never specified coordinates. He claimed to be much further ahead than where he actually was. Those back home were now getting excited that Donald was making record time and catching up with the other competitors. Newspapers were comparing Donald to Francis Chichester. In mid-December, Donald reported he was advancing rapidly towards the Southern Ocean. He logged his false positions and planned to come in third or fourth in the race to avoid close scrutiny of his logbooks. He planned out all his fake positions, then started a secret logbook with his real positions. At the time, he filmed and recorded himself playing the part of the positive, competent sailor. On Christmas Eve 1968, Donald made a radio call to his wife Claire. He couldn't tell her about his plan, and Claire couldn't tell him about how she was worried sick. Both of them put on a happy, confident front for the press. He was asked to give a precise position, but refused, and stated that he was, quote, off Cape Town, which was much further than the fake position he had planned out earlier. In mid-January, Donald lied and reported he was having issues with his radio and had to shut it off. Due to the radio silence, newspapers began to exaggerate Donald's estimated position to create excitement. The man coming in second place, Nigel Tetley, began to feel the pressure, believing that Donald was closing in on him. In reality, Donald was sailing aimlessly along the east coast of Brazil, waiting for others to pass him as they headed north back to Britain. On March 8, 1969, Donald desperately needed to make repairs on his boat and stopped at the tiny settlement of Rio Salado in Argentina, breaking the rules of the race. His arrival was logged by the Coast Guard, but he managed to get away without anyone realizing who he was. Donald then decided to head south to film and experience the Southern Ocean conditions to make his logs seem more legitimate. The more Donald fabricated his logs, the harder it became for him to officially drop out of the race, as he was nowhere near his reported positions. On April 22nd, Robin Knox-Johnston completed his voyage and won the Golden Globe Trophy, becoming the first person to sail solo non-stop around the world. It took him 312 days. By now, Donald Crowhurst and Nigel Tetley were the only two people left in the race, and it was a head-to-head battle for the £5,000 cash prize. Nigel Tetley's boat was in very bad shape at this point, but he decided to push harder in order to win the fastest time. On May 20th, Nigel Tetley ran into a storm which caused his boat to start breaking apart. He abandoned ship and dropped out of the race. Suddenly, Donald found himself exactly where he didn't want to be. He was the last man standing, and his falsely reported high speeds guaranteed him the £5,000 prize. He wanted to avoid close examination of his logbooks, but now it was inevitable. He had calculated fake positions to write down in his logbook, but some of his speeds were unrealistic. Plus, he never actually experienced the roaring 40s and had no idea how accurately he could describe the conditions. In mid-June, Donald and his publicity agent exchanged telegrams about television appearances, interviews, and how a fleet of boats and helicopters were waiting to welcome Donald home. Over the next several days, the Teignmouth Electron drifted in the mid-Atlantic untended, as its captain descended into a deeply disturbed state. It's hard to imagine how Donald must have been feeling at this stage. He had already endured 8 months of total solitude while also battling the harsh conditions of the open seas. He couldn't drop out of the race as he was far behind his reported positions and he would be exposed as a fraud. He couldn't keep going as his boat likely wouldn't survive, and if it did, he risked being exposed through his fabricated logbook. His reputation as a businessman and engineer would be destroyed and he'd face financial ruin. Desperate, lonely, lost, unable to find a solution, Donald began writing about philosophy and metaphysics. Over the next 8 days, he wrote a 25,000-word manifesto that revealed how tortured and disconnected from reality he became. His manifesto was rambling and incoherent at times. It contained ruminations about mathematical and religious philosophy, as well as mental arguments with himself and with Einstein about the purpose of life. He seemed to have concluded that human beings were all part of a game controlled by some higher beings. His mental state had deteriorated so much that he didn't even mention his 4 children in his writings. Towards the end, the writings became more and more unclear, but alludes to a revelation. Now is revealed the true nature and purpose and power of the game offense. I am what I am, and I see the nature of my offense. It is finished. It is finished. It is the mercy. Donald's last log entry was dated July 1st, 1969. The Teignmouth Electron was found abandoned by a cargo ship in the mid-Atlantic. It is presumed that Donald had jumped overboard. Only 3 of the 4 logbooks he carried were found, including one with his real positions. The truth was reported in the newspapers. Robin Knox-Johnston was the only man who finished the Golden Globe race around the world. He donated the £5,000 cash prize to the Crowhurst family. Today, the remnants of the Teignmouth Electron lay abandoned on the Caribbean island of Cayman Brac. Donald Crowhurst's body was never found.